The story begins in the lavish home of Richard Devereaux, a self-made millionaire known for his sharp business acumen and extravagant lifestyle. He was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: money, power, and a commanding presence that demanded respect from everyone in his orbit. His mansion, nestled on the outskirts of the city, was a symbol of his success, complete with sprawling gardens, luxurious decor, and a small army of staff to maintain the appearance of perfection that Richard so meticulously curated. He had everything anyone could dream of, or so it seemed. Among the staff was Naomi Johnson, a quiet, diligent black woman in her late 20s who had worked as a maid in the Devereaux household for several years. Naomi's presence in the house was often overlooked by the Devereaux family and their wealthy friends, but she was indispensable to the smooth running of their home. She moved with grace through the grand halls, always in the background, ensuring every room sparkled, every meal was served promptly, and every task was completed with precision. To Naomi, this job was more than just work. It was her means of supporting her family and her dream of eventually starting a life outside of the oppressive service she found herself in. Naomi had always maintained a professional distance from Richard, as was expected. In fact, she had barely spoken more than a few polite sentences to him over the years, but as time passed, something between them shifted. It started with small, seemingly innocent moments: a lingering glance from Richard when she entered the room, an unexpected compliment on her work. Naomi dismissed these incidents at first, telling herself that she was imagining things, but Richard's attention only grew more intense. He began to find excuses to be around her, asking for her specifically when he needed something in the house, offering her small favors, and making polite conversation that slowly became more personal. Despite her initial discomfort, Naomi found herself drawn to Richard. He was charming in a way that was hard to resist, and he had a way of making her feel seen, something she hadn't experienced in her years of working for wealthy families. Naomi had always been cautious, knowing her place in the household and the dangers of crossing any boundaries, but Richard's persistent attention chipped away at her resolve. They started to exchange glances that lingered too long, conversations that hinted at something more than employer and employee. The unspoken tension between them grew until one evening it finally snapped. It happened in the quiet stillness of the late evening, long after the rest of the household had retired for the night. Richard had asked Naomi to stay late to help with some extra tasks. When she finished her duties and was about to leave, he stopped her. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Naomi could feel her heart racing as Richard stood too close, his gaze locked on hers. She knew this was wrong, knew the boundaries they were crossing, but in that moment the pull between them was undeniable. Before either of them could reconsider, they were in each other's arms, giving in to the passion that had been building for months. What followed was a brief but intense affair hidden from everyone else in the household. Naomi knew it couldn't last, that it was a dangerous game she was playing, but for a while she allowed herself to be swept away by the fantasy. Richard, for his part, was intoxicated by the thrill of their secret encounters, seeing Naomi not just as a servant, but as someone who challenged the boredom of his privileged life. He convinced himself that no one would ever find out and that their arrangement could remain hidden forever. The affair, however, was not without its consequences. Naomi soon found herself experiencing unfamiliar symptoms: nausea, fatigue, and the unmistakable realization that she was pregnant. The shock of it hit her like a tidal wave. She had never imagined this outcome. For days she wrestled with what to do, knowing that keeping the pregnancy a secret was impossible. Richard had to know, but she feared his reaction more than anything. Would he stand by her, or would he turn his back on her? Deep down, she already knew the answer. One evening, when the house was quiet, Naomi mustered the courage to approach Richard with the news. She found him in his study, looking over some papers, completely unaware of the bombshell she was about to drop. When she told him, the color drained from his face. At first, he stared at her in stunned silence, unable to process what she had just said. Then, his shock turned to anger. Richard, the man who had once been so charming and tender with her, now looked at Naomi with cold detachment. "How could you let this happen?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. Naomi's heart sank. She had hoped in some small part of her mind that he might take responsibility, that he would at least offer some kind of support, but his words made it clear that he saw her as nothing more than a problem that needed to be dealt with. The affair had been a mistake in his eyes, something he wanted to forget. A child was the last thing he wanted, especially a child with a maid. He was more concerned about his reputation, his image, and the potential scandal that could ruin him if word got out. "You need to leave," he said, his tone final. "I'll arrange something for you. But you can't stay here. This has to end." Naomi stood there, stunned, her mind racing as she processed his words. She had expected rejection, but the cruelty of his response was a blow she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just refusing to acknowledge the child they had created, he was throwing her out, abandoning her without any real support. Richard offered her a small sum of money, a pittance compared to his vast wealth, and expected her to disappear from his life. Naomi was devastated. Her heart broke as she realized the full extent of Richard's betrayal. The man she had once been captivated by had shown his true colors, and now she was alone, pregnant, and without a job. There was no choice but to leave, to start over somewhere else. She packed her belongings and walked out of the mansion. The place that had once been her livelihood, now a prison she was escaping. With no place to go, Naomi was forced to rely on her strength and determination. She had grown up facing adversity and knew how to survive, but this situation was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She found a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city and began piecing her life back together. The early stages of her pregnancy were difficult, both physically and emotionally. She worked long hours cleaning houses, taking on any job she could find to make ends meet. The money Richard had given her ran out quickly, leaving her to fend for herself completely. Despite the hardship, Naomi's resolve never wavered. She refused to let her circumstances define her or her child's future. As her pregnancy progressed, she prepared herself for the new chapter in her life, one where she would be both mother and provider. The pain of Richard's rejection lingered, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the life growing inside her. The child, she vowed, would never know the man who had abandoned them. Naomi was determined to give her baby the love and care Richard had denied them, even if it meant struggling every day to survive. Her journey was one of resilience, and though the future was uncertain, Naomi knew that she would do whatever it took to protect her child from the harsh realities of the world. She would raise her baby with dignity, love, and strength, qualities that Richard had failed to show her but which she would never fail to pass on. Naomi's new life was filled with hardships that seemed insurmountable at times. After Richard had thrown her out, she found herself completely alone, without a safety net or a single soul to turn to. She was forced to move to a poor, run-down neighborhood far from the grand estate she once cleaned. The apartment she found was small, dingy, and barely habitable. The walls were cracked, the plumbing was unreliable, and the neighborhood was far from safe, but it was the only place she could afford. The first few months were the hardest. Naomi was pregnant and her body was exhausted. Every step felt like a mountain, and the physical toll of her condition made the emotional weight even heavier. She often woke up in the middle of the night, her mind swirling with worry about the future. How would she provide for her child? How would she survive in a world that seemed stacked against her at every turn? Yet Naomi was not the type to give up. She had grown up poor and had always been a fighter. Despite her fears, she knew she had no choice but to keep going. Every morning, she forced herself out of bed, her belly growing larger with each passing day. She took whatever jobs she could find, scrubbing floors, cleaning houses, doing laundry, anything that would put food on the table. Each job was grueling and the pay was meager, but it was enough to survive. She worked tirelessly, often pushing through the pain and fatigue that came with her pregnancy, knowing that she had no other option. The people she worked for were often indifferent, seeing her as nothing more than a tool to get their dirty work done. But Naomi didn't let their cold stares or dismissive comments affect her. She had a purpose, and that purpose was her child. She knew that every dollar she earned was a step toward giving her baby a better life. The dream of raising her child in a world far away from the one she had come to know as a servant kept her going. As the months passed, Naomi's belly grew rounder and the day of her child's birth drew closer. Her pregnancy was difficult, and without the support of a partner or family, the weight of it all fell squarely on her shoulders. There were days when the isolation felt unbearable, when she cried herself to sleep out of exhaustion and fear. But even in her darkest moments, She never regretted the decision to keep her child. The baby, she knew, was innocent in all of this and deserved a chance at a life full of love, something she was determined to provide. The day finally came when Naomi gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The pain of childbirth was immense, but when she held her son for the first time, all the struggles and suffering seemed to fade into the background. She named him Elijah, and as she looked into his tiny, innocent eyes, she vowed to give him everything she had, no matter how difficult it would be. Elijah became Naomi's entire world. He was her reason for waking up each morning, her reason for fighting through the exhaustion and pain. Motherhood was not easy. Naomi quickly realized that raising a child on her own, while working multiple jobs, was an almost impossible task. She had no one to turn to for help, no family nearby, no friends to lean on. She had to do everything herself. Her days became a blur of work and childcare. She would wake up before dawn to feed Elijah, then rush to her cleaning jobs, often carrying him with her because she couldn't afford childcare. At night, after a long day of work, she would return home and collapse onto her tiny bed, too exhausted to do anything but sleep for a few precious hours before it all started again. Money was always tight. Naomi had to make every dollar stretch as far as it could go. She learned to live with less, sacrificing her own needs to ensure that Elijah had enough to eat and a roof over their heads. She wore old clothes patched up when they began to tear and ate simple meals, often skipping dinner so that her son could have more. But no matter how difficult things got, Naomi never let Elijah see her struggle. She wanted him to grow up feeling loved, not burdened by the weight of their poverty. Despite the challenges, Naomi found joy in the small moments she shared with her son. Elijah grew quickly, and his laughter filled their tiny apartment with warmth and light. Naomi would sit with him in the evenings, reading to him from old second-hand books she had picked up at a thrift store. She would sing to him as she rocked him to sleep, her voice soft and full of love. Elijah may not have had the material comforts that other children had, but he had a mother who loved him fiercely and would do anything to protect him. As Elijah grew older, it became clear that he was a bright, inquisitive child. He was always asking questions, eager to learn about the world around him. Naomi encouraged his curiosity, knowing that education would be his ticket to a better life. She worked hard to ensure that Elijah had access to good schools, even though it meant taking on more jobs and working even longer hours. She would often come home late at night, exhausted from cleaning wealthy homes, but she would still make time to sit with Elijah and help him with his homework. Naomi's sacrifices did not go unnoticed. Elijah knew, even at a young age, how hard his mother worked to provide for him. He saw the toll it took on her, the way her hands were rough and calloused from years of cleaning, the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, but he also saw her strength and her unwavering love for him. It inspired him to work hard in school, to make the most of the opportunities his mother had fought so hard to give him. Years passed, and Elijah grew into a young man with a bright future ahead of him. He excelled in school, earning scholarships that would take him far from the life of poverty he had known. Naomi watched with pride as her son flourished, knowing that all of her sacrifices had been worth it. She had raised a kind, intelligent, and determined young man who was ready to take on the world. But even as Elijah thrived, Naomi's own life continued to be a constant struggle. She was older now, and the years of hard labor had taken a toll on her body. Her back ached constantly, her hands were arthritic, and the long hours of physical labor left her exhausted. Yet she never complained. She had built a life for herself and her son, one filled with love and perseverance, and that was enough for her. Though Richard had long been out of their lives, Naomi never told Elijah about his father. She wanted to protect him from the pain of knowing that the man who had given him life had also rejected him. To her, Elijah was a miracle, someone who deserved only the best. She never wanted him to feel like he was anything less than extraordinary, and she feared that knowing the truth about his father might tarnish that. Naomi's world was small, but it was filled with meaning. She continued to work, continued to care for Elijah, and continued to push through the hardships that life threw at her. In her quiet moments, when the weight of the world felt especially heavy, she would sit by the window in their apartment, looking out at the city beyond. She would think about the life she had left behind, the luxury, the ease, the man who had thrown her away, and she would feel a deep sense of peace. She had built a life of her own, one filled with love and sacrifice, and no one could take that away from her. Elisha was her greatest achievement, and as he grew into a man, Naomi knew that all the struggles, all the hirdache, had been worth it. She had given him the one thing Richard could never give: unconditional love. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. As the years passed, Richard Devereux's life had not turned out the way he had expected. In his prime, he had been the envy of everyone around him, a millionaire with a sprawling estate, a beautiful wife, and successful businesses that seemed to flourish effortlessly under his command. He had built a life that many aspired to, a perfect facade of wealth and success. But behind the scenes, Richard's life had become increasingly hollow. His marriage, once the foundation of his social and business standing, had long since crumbled. His wife, Catherine, had grown distant over the years. She was a socialite, more interested in the glamorous parties and high society gatherings than in maintaining their marriage. What had started as a partnership of convenience, designed to enhance their status in society, slowly eroded into a cold, transactional relationship. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their conversations were superficial, centered around appearances rather than any true connection. Their mansion, once filled with the sounds of laughter and the buzz of activity, became a cavernous, empty shell. Catherine began spending more and more time away, traveling with friends, attending galas, and making herself scarce. Richard, once proud of his perfect life, found himself sitting alone in the vast home that now felt more like a gilded cage than a palace. Despite his wealth and success, Richard couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was missing from his life. He had spent so many years building his fortune, focused on maintaining his public image, that he had forgotten what it was like to feel truly fulfilled. The pursuit of wealth had once excited him, driven him to climb the social and financial ladder, but now it left him feeling empty. Even his children, those he had once thought would carry on his legacy, had become a source of disappointment. They had grown up spoiled by the riches he provided, each of them living lives of excess without ever truly appreciating the work it had taken to amass such wealth. Richard's oldest son, William, had become involved in a series of scandals that threatened to tarnish the family's reputation. He had squandered much of the money Richard had given him on frivolous ventures, failed investments, and reckless behavior. His reckless lifestyle had become a liability, not just for himself, but for the family name Richard had worked so hard to protect. His other children, while not as publicly destructive as William, had shown little interest in carrying on the family business. They had become absorbed in their own privileged lives, more concerned with the next luxury vacation or high-end shopping spree than in taking any real responsibility. The weight of his personal failures hung over Richard like a dark cloud, though he would never admit it publicly. Outwardly, he remained the polished, successful millionaire that society expected him to be. He attended events, gave interviews, and smiled for the cameras, but in private he was a man wrestling with regret. The walls of his mansion, once a symbol of his success, now felt suffocating. He had spent so much time chasing wealth and status that he had lost sight of what truly mattered, and now it was too late to fix the broken pieces of his life. Late at night, Richard found himself reflecting on the choices he had made, particularly the ones that had led him down this lonely path. He thought often of Naomi, the young black maid he had so cruelly cast aside all those years ago. At the time, he had convinced himself that cutting her out of his life was the only option, a necessary move to protect his image and avoid scandal. But as the years passed, the memory of what he had done began to haunt him. He had never spoken of her again, never acknowledged the child she had carried, and had assumed that she would simply fade into obscurity. But now, in the quiet of his empty house, he couldn't escape the thought of her. Richard often wondered what had become of Naomi and the child. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself that it was all in the past, that he had made the right decision for himself and his reputation. But deep down he knew he had been a coward. He had chosen his image over doing the right thing. He had discarded a woman who had cared for him and had abandoned a child, his own flesh and blood, because he had been too afraid of the consequences. The weight of that guilt gnawed at him, especially as his own life unraveled. His legitimate children, who had grown up with every advantage, seemed to want nothing to do with him except for his money. But the child he had cast aside, the one he had never even acknowledged, might have been different. In the years that followed, Richard tried to busy himself with work, throwing himself back into his business ventures in an attempt to distract himself from the void in his personal life. But even that no longer brought him the satisfaction it once had. He was older now, and the fire that had driven him in his youth was gone. The business world had changed, and though Richard remained wealthy, he was no longer the innovative leader he had once been. Younger, hungrier competitors were taking over, and the sense of being left behind only deepened his isolation. One day, while flipping through financial reports in his study, Richard came across an article in a business journal that caught his eye. The article was about a young, up-and-coming entrepreneur named Elijah Johnson. The name was unremarkable, but something about the young man's photo, his demeanor, struck Richard. Elijah had an air of confidence about him, a sharp mind that reminded Richard of himself in his younger years. He was making waves in the tech industry, building a name for himself as an innovative thinker and a rising star. Richard's interest peaked as he read further. There was something familiar about Elijah, something that Richard couldn't quite place. He studied the photo again, noting the young man's striking features, his piercing eyes, and the determination in his expression. It was then that it hit him, a realization so sudden and jarring that Richard's heart seemed to skip a beat. Elijah looked like him. There, in the young man's face, were the unmistakable traits of the Devereaux family, the same sharp jawline, the same intense gaze. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the truth began to settle in. Could it be? Could this Elijah Johnson be the child Naomi had carried all those years ago? The thought seemed impossible, yet Richard couldn't shake the feeling that it was true. He scrambled to find more information, scouring the internet for details about Elijah's background. His heart raced as he read about Elijah's upbringing, his humble beginnings, and the single mother who had raised him. Naomi. It had to be her. For the first time in years, Richard felt a deep, visceral fear. He had spent his life running from the consequences of his actions, but now they had come back to confront him in the most unexpected way. The child he had abandoned had not faded into obscurity as he had hoped. Instead, he had grown into a successful, brilliant man, one who had made a name for himself without the wealth or privileges Richard had denied him. Richard's mind raced with questions. Did Elijah know about him? Did Naomi ever tell him the truth about his father? What would happen if they ever crossed paths? The thought of meeting Elijah filled Richard with dread, but also with a strange sense of curiosity. He had no idea what kind of man Elijah was, but there was a part of him that couldn't help but feel drawn to his own flesh and blood, to the son he had never known. For days, Richard was consumed by the thought of Elijah. He couldn't focus on his work, couldn't sleep without thinking about the life he had missed out on. The more he thought about it, the more the guilt gnawed at him. Elijah had grown up without a father, while Richard had lived in luxury, oblivious to the life he had left behind. He had no idea what kind of challenges Naomi had faced, how hard she had worked to give Elijah a future. Richard had never considered the consequences of his actions back then, but now they were staring him in the face. As the realization settled in, Richard knew that his past was about to catch up with him. He had spent years living a lie, pretending that his actions hadn't mattered, but now the truth was coming for him. Elijah Johnson, his son, was out there, a living testament to the life Richard had chosen to abandon, and sooner or later their paths would cross. When that happened, Richard knew that he would have to face the consequences of the choices he had made all those years ago. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of his place in the world, now found himself standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of what awaited him on the other side. The day that Richard Devereaux had both feared and anticipated arrived in a way he could never have predicted. It began as an ordinary afternoon, with the crisp fall air seeping through the windows of his office as he reviewed paperwork for yet another business deal. Despite his growing age and the increasing irrelevance he felt in the business world, Richard still clung to his routines. These routines had become his lifeline, a way to stave off the deep loneliness that had taken root in his life. But today, the routine would be broken in a way that would change everything. Unbeknownst to Richard, Elijah Johnson, the son he had abandoned before he was even born, was about to enter his life in the most unexpected manner. Elijah had risen to prominence in the tech industry, quickly building a name for himself with innovative ideas that disrupted traditional markets. His company, a rising star in artificial intelligence, had drawn attention from investors all over the world, including Richard's own firm. Richard's company, though still powerful, had struggled to stay competitive in recent years, and Elijah's enterprise represented a lucrative opportunity. For Richard, it was supposed to be just another business deal, an exciting prospect that could inject new life into his waning empire. The meeting was set up by Richard's advisors, who saw Elijah's company as the perfect acquisition target. Richard had been briefed on the young entrepreneur but had no idea what was about to unfold. He had not seen Elijah's face in person yet, only the photos from business articles and media coverage. He hadn't connected the dots, hadn't realized that the man whose company he was about to negotiate with was his own son. When Elijah entered the boardroom, Richard's breath caught in his throat. The young man who stood before him was tall, with a commanding presence that immediately drew attention. His eyes were sharp, observant, and behind them was a quick intelligence that filled the room with energy. But it wasn't just Elijah's commanding aura that struck Richard. It was the resemblance. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. The angular jawline, the intensity in his eyes, even the way he carried himself, it was all unmistakably Devereaux. For a moment, Richard sat frozen, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Could it be? Could this be the same Elijah Johnson he had read about? The son he had abandoned decades ago? The shock of recognition was overwhelming, and Richard found himself unable to speak. He felt a wave of emotions crash over him: guilt, fear, curiosity, and a deep, aching regret. Elijah, of course, had no idea about the identity of the man sitting across from him. To him, Richard Devereaux was just another potential investor, another business magnate interested in what his company had to offer. Elijah had worked tirelessly to get to this point, building his business from the ground up with the same drive and determination that Richard himself had once possessed. He had no idea of the personal history between them, no inkling that the man he was about to negotiate with was the father who had abandoned him before he was born. The meeting proceeded as planned, with Elijah presenting his company's vision and outlining the potential for collaboration. But Richard could barely focus on the details of the proposal. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with memories of Naomi and the decisions he had made all those years ago. He watched Elijah speak, saw the fire and passion in his eyes, and realized that this young man, this stranger, was his blood. The magnitude of that realization was staggering. How had he not seen it sooner? How had he lived his life so detached from the reality of what he had done? Richard knew he had to speak to Elijah, but how could he even begin to explain the truth? How could he tell this accomplished, intelligent man that he had been abandoned by his father, a father who had chosen wealth and reputation over his own child? The thought of it terrified him. He didn't know how Elijah would react, didn't know if the young man would even care. Would he hate Richard for what he had done? Would he walk away, disgusted by the revelation, or would he demand answers? Richard's heart pounded with the weight of uncertainty. As the meeting came to a close, Richard found himself unable to hold back any longer. He stood, his voice shaky and unsteady, and addressed Elijah directly. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his words faltering, "there's something I need to tell you, something you deserve to know." Elijah paused, his expression curious but wary. "What is it, Mr. Devereaux?" he asked, his voice polite but guarded. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was it, the moment he had feared for so long. "This isn't just about business," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something more. I think you might be my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with emotion. For a moment, there was only silence. Elijah stared at Richard, his face unreadable, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Then, slowly, a mixture of confusion and disbelief crossed his features. "I'm sorry," Elijah said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Your son? What are you talking about?" Richard took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "Your mother, Naomi Johnson. I knew her, a long time ago. We had an affair, and she became pregnant. I didn't know. Well, I knew, but I didn't do the right thing. I walked away, I abandoned her, and I abandoned you. I've lived with that regret for years, and now standing here looking at you, I can see the truth. You're my son." Elijah's expression darkened, the confusion on his face giving way to something colder. His eyes narrowed as he processed the gravity of Richard's confession. "My mother never told me who my father was," he said slowly, his voice tight with anger. "But now you're telling me that all this time it was you, and you just walked away? You left her, left us, without so much as a second thought?" Richard's heart sank as he saw the hurt and anger in Elijah's eyes. This was exactly what he had feared. "I was a coward," Richard admitted, his voice breaking. "I was more concerned about my reputation, my business. I didn't have the courage to face the consequences of my actions. I know it's no excuse, and I know I can't take back what I did. But I need you to know that I've regretted it every day since." Elijah stood in silence for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head, his voice bitter. "Regret? You think regret changes anything? You think that makes up for the fact that my mother had to raise me on her own, struggling every day while you sat in your mansion with your millions?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Everything Elijah was saying was true, and there was nothing Richard could say to make it right. He had lived his life in luxury, while Naomi had borne the brunt of his selfishness. He had failed them both in ways he could never undo. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Elijah continued, his voice filled with restrained fury. "That I'll forgive you? That we'll somehow have a relationship after all these years? You don't get to just show up now and act like you care." "I don't expect anything," Richard said quietly. "I just wanted you to know the truth. You have every right to hate me." Elijah stared at him for a long time, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," he said. "You've had your life. Now I have mine. Maybe you should have stayed in the past where you belong." With that, Elijah turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Richard standing alone. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like never before. He had been given the chance to face the truth, to confront the son he had abandoned, but there was no redemption to be found. Elijah was gone, and with him, any hope Richard had of making things right. For the first time in his life, Richard felt truly powerless. He had built an empire, accumulated unimaginable wealth, and yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. The son he had never known had walked away, leaving Richard to reckon with the consequences of a life lived in selfishness and fear. And now, he was left alone once again, with nothing but his regrets to keep him company.